All right, so we can kind of just jump into it. So this is InteraCity. We're going to be talking about a game that I've been working on for a board game design course. And then we're also going to talk about how it fits into the landscape of other city builders. And then we're going to kind of look at the title is a little bit confusing. It's going to be about sort of contrastive learning and what cultural inferences that we can kind of make and associate with games and how those work. So a little about me. Who is Josh Hirshfield? I graduated UConn DMD. That was about a year ago in May, and right now I'm an MFA student at the NYU Game Center. I'm the CEO and founder of Pyrobook Studios. We've made a few things. We're kind of around, and I'm currently working on InteraCity, but also I'm making like 8 games right now, and my thesis is coming up, and the hardest thing is going to be choosing one of them, which I'm sure a lot of you can talk about. I'd also like to mention before we kind of jump into this, I was not sure if this presentation was going to be recorded, so some of these slides are a little wordy because I wanted to make sure the information kind of got across. But I kind of went back and cut it down to size. And yeah, so what is InteraCity? It's a cooperative city building board game. It's tile based, and the core idea and concept is that there are adjacency effects. So anything that you place is a thing that triggers something else around it, and you're building something. And it's sort of a simple complex design philosophy, and simple complex systems are the systems within science that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in which a very complex structure is made up of several smaller and very digestible systems. So an engine has gears and so all these mechanical components that each make up a larger whole. And then, of course, there's the design philosophy of just lowering the cognitive load for each individual player so that the collective cognitive load is very high. Yeah, we'll just jump right in. And so we're going to be talking about a few different things in this presentation. Like I said before, we're going to kind of start by exploring how we can use advanced concepts in the classroom and contrast with personal and real world experiences. And we're going to kind of start with InteraCity and how that can be used to represent urban planning. And it's also kind of touch on SimCity. But before we do that, I kind of wanted to take this opportunity. I know this kind of looks funny, but I seriously do mean to say that we live in an age of unfortunate misinformation and disinformation, and I have done my best to find peer-reviewed articles in journals and contact experts where I can. But I'm none of these things. I'm a games designer first. I make fun things first, and I encourage all of you to check my sources and question the things that I am saying. And yeah, no, seriously, like we really need to start thinking about this more. So here's a little bit more about InteraCity. It's cooperative, so you're working together to build a city. The whole idea is positive and negative adjacency effects. This card that I have on the right or left, I guess, is the most advanced card in the game. It's really complicated. We're going to talk about kind of how that works. But this game started out as something even more complex than what you see on the screen. It was all about these different tokens and different effects and different tiles and different all this stuff. And eventually I broke it down to the simple system of buying and placing buildings and using that system to do different things. So each one of the main roles acts differently. And here's sort of some examples. So you have, going from left to right, you have a villa, which is a residential card. Residential is all about building up your currency over time very slowly, right? Commercial is the one in the middle. It's all about gaining currency based on how much currency you have and things around it. And then finally, in industry, you place the card down and immediately gain a certain amount dependent on its adjacency bonuses. Here's a bunch of complex stuff. These are what happens when you kind of get to higher level play. And one thing that I've been trying to encourage players to do is to identify which ones look more complex and tackle them later in the game. So you have a slow linear buildup of cards that look like this at the beginning, and you place them down, and they're simple and they help you. And then as time goes on, you slowly learn to understand and digest all of these. And specifically for the Street with Trolley Lane card, I have had players look at that and go, "Oh my God, I don't want to look at that or play that because it's so advanced." And by the time they finish the game, they are saying, "Oh, if we activate this effect on this thing, it's a slowing." And then a few of you have actually played this game, so I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So the player goals are also kind of indicative of that. They each have their own specific thing that they need to do. Infrastructure is entirely dependent on other players. They can't win without actually making people do stuff, so they need to argue and they need to talk and cooperate. Industry is a ticking time bomb. You want to slow down industry as much as possible. If they place more than 10 buildings, you lose. So that creates a tension in the game. There's a reason that you're cooperating and a reason that you're arguing. Residential and commercial are just sort of about growth and getting larger. So the unique pieces of each player were a very important part of this. It felt kind of empty to just kind of say, oh, just go, just build, you know? So that's not fun. So the infrastructure player actually decides who goes when. So there's an order of operations. There's a stack, right? Effects happen according to how the group wants them to be dictated. The industry only gains on placement. Residential doesn't have anything. I just gave up. Commercial actually is all about bottoming out or saving up as much money as possible. So you each have these individual styles of gameplay. Then, of course, there's adjacency aspects and stereotypes for each of these. So, like, residential doesn't like big smoky factories. Commercial wants everything around them all the time, really except for themselves, to sell as much as possible. Industry doesn't really care. They just want to place wherever they can. And infrastructure really thrives when they are around the most kinds of things. So you have these very much non-overlapping desires that you have to work around. And that kind of results in some really cool stuff. So there's never a correct decision, and there's never a way that you can play this game and just say, oh, let's just do this tactic again. Because the way that you have these cards randomized and the way that this game is set up is that you have to really tackle each scenario individually. And you can see there's a screenshot of some of my friends at NYU playing. And I had a video, but I couldn't get it on the Google Drive, the Google Slides. But yeah, they were yelling at each other because none of them would listen to one another because if you look at the board, they're only on turn 2. And I thought that was really funny. So, oh, and then one thing I did want to quickly touch on was abuse of the utilization of the last in first out stack. And if you're familiar with the way that Magic the Gathering works, that just means that the last effect to be triggered has to be completed before that. So let's talk about digital city builders. And I know I'm going really fast, so please interrupt me if you have any questions. So InteraCity is all about working together to satisfy each other's goals. You have to help each other to succeed. Whereas, City Skylines and SimCity, they kind of are just, satisfy the population, make people happy, which would be awesome if that was how it worked. We Need More Homes kind of is an example that I've thought about a lot. I've played City Skylines a lot. I've hit the build limit of 65,536 buildings, which kind of sucks because you just kind of stop playing. And once you get to that point, you start to notice all the artificiality of the game and how empty it kind of is. So we need more homes is such a weird thing to say, because why do we need more homes, right? You just have to build your city, give us more things, and you get rid of anything that's in the way and you build more homes. And then there's this issue called not enough workers. And not enough workers is something that I have really, really struggled with. And I've got a couple of screenshots here. And one of them is from Grandma's Aluminum Market, and it just says not enough workers. And as you can see, there's stats about education, and there's stats about commute and service time and all this stuff. And the problem is that you can't solve that problem by building more homes. You also can't solve that problem by just building more infrastructure, and you can't solve that problem by just getting more people in. For some reason, the game actually has these advanced supply chains that have you sitting here analyzing them over time and saying, what do I actually need to change in my supply chain to not have people move into this city but change jobs? That's the way that this game works. It's an artificial sort of system that makes you think that this is how society works, which kind of delves into what we're sort of talking about, and where I'm kind of going with all of this is that what I tried to do with InteraCity was have non-static dynamic scenarios in which players are saying, okay, how can we actually solve these problems in new and effective ways depending on the criteria we are given? Whereas lots of digital city builders kind of have this artificial sense to them where you're ultimately using the same tactics over and over to solve the same problems, right? You're not really tackling the idea and issue of building a city. So let's talk about the real meat of this, which is contrasting with the real world. Like, what is actually being used to do this, and what do people actually get from this? So if you actually play City Skylines or you play SimCity, you know that if you have high crime, and you build police stations everywhere, all the crime goes away, and suddenly you have a utopia. And that is just not how it works. The same thing can be said for high pollution, where you replace all energy sources with renewables, right? That immediately solves the problem, which, yes, granted, in an ideal world, that is true. If we overnight flipped everything, that would solve a lot of issues with energy. But the problem with city skylines and the problem with SimCity is that once you do that, all of the pollution magically vanishes. There are no problems with jobs. There's no problems with infrastructure. There's no problems with batteries. There's nothing that you have to think about that would really kind of trigger that in the real world. And of course, it's also very expensive in the games, which is also a byproduct of when they came out. But and then the example that I think is really, really interesting is the cannabis one. Oh, there we go. I think I no, Siri, let's talk about that one for a second because it's really specific and there's a lot of really interesting studies that you can see about what happens when cannabis is legalized federally, in the state level, and just throughout the world. And it's the bottom point here. But as you can imagine, it does lead to a better quality of life, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's because people are actually using cannabis. It's more because the legal access to it simply has trickling and domino effects that make society easier to operate in. You no longer have to worry about related arrests or, you don't have to, you can start thinking about what you're going to do with that sales tax. And the standards of the product go up, and it makes people happier because they can operate in a society in which this is accepted, right? So that's one huge point. And then, then we can also, I've already kind of touched on these, but the big one on this slide is the big two, I think, are that pollution is never displayed accurately. It is simply a giant blob that grows over time, and it never actually has any direct effects on people's health. That's a huge one. Something as simple as littering in SimCity and City Skylines and all these big popular city builders is not even touched upon. There's no littering. So yeah, it's it's a little weird. And of course, there's also the idea of like you can do whatever you want. There's, they don't really talk about where the cities are in the world and what government there is, and the fact that you can provide universal healthcare in a lot of these games is a little bit of a big step that I think the involvement of I say there the involvement of larger societal organizations is a crucial aspect of that. Yeah. Yes, that's so the question was that is there a built-in assumption that a bigger city is a better city? And ultimately, yes. You want to build the largest possible city to achieve the largest possible goals. Games like City Skylines actually lock certain services such as sewage treatment and renewable energies and higher education, such as even to the level of high schools behind population gates, which that's the reaction I had. And that leads to some that specifically, just to touch on that, leads to interesting sort of domino effects in the game where you will have this generation of people who have no idea what's going on and are super uneducated, and that slowly stalls your ability to create more jobs and more businesses and more industrial sectors because you just can't yet. You have to wait longer, which is part of that artificiality to inflate the game time. Then there's a few more examples. The first, the main two, and I even cite my own work in this. And but in the big city builders, you kind of want to make people happy, right? The government exists to make people happy, and unfortunately, in the U.S., the majority of politicians will do things to get themselves reelected rather than actually make people happy. Yeah, and then in InteraCity as well, I wanted to create an ideal scenario in which everyone is trying to help each other succeed in their own respective rights, but even so, that is not always how it works, and that's just unfortunate. So kind of what can we take away from this as game designers? I'm going to talk about education designers in a second, but designing thematically and actually performing heavy research into these topics is the first one. And there are real and objectively surveyable cultural implications as to how these design decisions actually impact our society. There is a wonderful, there's a wonderful article in the Los Angeles Times about how SimCity went on to inspire a whole generation of city builders and city planners. And it just goes into detail about all these people who played this game and then said, wow, that's cool. I want to look at this more and I want to do this more. So the perception of that really does matter. And yeah, we should actively challenge our designs both creatively and objectively, and really say to ourselves, if this makes an impact, is it going to make an impact that is good? And what is my authorial intent here? And how will that be perceived? So as educational designers, what can we take away from this? So basically the way that you would use this to teach someone about society, if you play SimCity, you already have hopefully a foundation of what it's like to be in a society. But once you play it, you kind of get that larger picture, you get that bird's eye view. And taking that and critically thinking about it and contrasting it with other topics, both in and out of the classroom with students, is a way that you can kind of say that, right? You can say like, okay, so you played SimCity, you saw there was crime everywhere, you built 50 police stations, you funded the police, the crime went away. Do you think that that's going to work in real life? And then kind of going from that and building off of that. But when designing experiences, one thing that I have found in the playtesting of InteraCity and sort of the main thing that keeps that game interesting from playthrough to playthrough is how players contrast the issues on their own, and they kind of think about how those pieces interact and how they fit together. And that is what makes it an educational experience, that you are taking this information and contrasting it with the way that you see this information in the real world and then go back into the game and do it again. So learning through analysis, basically. So how does that work? I've got a few examples. This is where the talk stops being about city builders and starts being about things that I really, really like. So games are, I think we're all here because we all believe games have a strong presence that other pieces of media don't have in some ways. And we're just going to talk about a few examples that I love. And the first topic that we're going to actually discuss is mental health and mental illness, and how strongly that can be represented through gameplay. So Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, I think most, if not all the people in this room are familiar with this game and the impact that it has on so many people. But in short, its representation of psychosis is woven in thematically, experientially, and mechanically, right? The designers of this game reached out to clinical consultants throughout the time of development and design to actually say, is this a proper, respectable, and accurate and honest representation of mental health in games? Is this a good way to introduce people to this topic? And they went through countless iterations of how that is actually portrayed, and they settled on the visions and voices and phantoms that you are combating actively throughout the game. And it is the non-artificial setbacks that you actually have happen when you lose those fights, right? And that is the most important part of it. And I included a letter here that was sent to the clinical consultants, the head clinical consultant on Hellblade. And it talks about how impactful that was and how they finally have a way to give this experience to others and really explain it in a way that they never could. So I'm going to talk about Gree next. This one is really intense. If you haven't played Gree, I would totally check it out. The idea is that you are slowly sort of coming to terms with loss in your broken mental state internally, and that is represented through the world of color and shapes and design and lots of indirect storytelling. So by that I mean that it's not just like saying you are growing. You are visibly seeing that environment change, and as you are experiencing that, you are understanding and gaining abilities which allow you to move forward and allow you to cope and allow you to build strategies, which in many ways is similar to how that works in real life. And finally, Celeste. I think that this is probably the most popular of this area of games. If you are making a game about anxiety and depression, it felt like to us we needed to show the same kind of kindness to the player that we want to show ourselves. And that design philosophy is from Matt Thorson. And that basically is why you can never really fail in Celeste, because the developers always wanted to say that just like with mental health struggles and personal struggles, you should be able to get back up and you should be able to take the time that you need to succeed. And I think that's a really beautiful statement. And there's also countless representatives in there, such as Battleline and Mr. Oshiro and the mountain as an impassable element itself, which is sort of feeds back into the whole idea of making a very difficult game loop, but also a very forgiving one. So let's kind of shift gears. Let's talk about BioShock. There's a lot of words on this slide. Yeah, so the main idea here is that if you have never played BioShock, the idea is individualism versus objectivism, right? Like, can you build a society around an ideal? And then how does that society fall apart? What does choice really mean? And how does utopia really fit into this? I have a lot of issues with the BioShock franchise. I have way more issues with BioShock Infinite. But I do think that there are parts of this game that talk about moral efficacy and the difference between a good and bad action and what a society without rules really looks like. And the one that I've italicized here is the collapse of a society in which everything represents good ideals. And this is extremely hard to grasp. There are people who you can sit down and give them books about this and they would walk away, and there are things that they could just not get if not experiential. So this is going to be a little bit more. I'm going to have two games here which my friends have made. We're going to just go one by one here. So the first one is Through a Glass, which is made by Mac Fox. She's not in this room, but if you haven't talked to her about this, I'd highly recommend it. She put a ton of work into this. But I have a quote here from her portfolio. And the whole game is about a girl struggling with derealization and depersonalization. So throughout the game, you are actually learning coping strategies and actively sort of going on that healing journey with her. And it's a really powerful game. It was a very personal project for her too. So she has a lot more to say about than I do, but you can see here that there's a lot of elements. My favorite is the difference between the depersonalized world and the realized world, and sort of the way that she represented that through an art piece, right, with each room. And actively seeing that change in the environment as you're playing is something that represents that feeling. And then this is something called the Mix Archives. It's made by a team of people at NYU. This was for their Game Studio 2 project, and this is insane. I have never seen a game of this caliber tackled by such a small team, and I really do mean that. There are a total of, I think, there are hundreds of articles on this fake news website, and all of them draw some level of misinformation. And the entire game is an experience in which you are led down incorrect paths into conspiracy theories. And it talks and explicitly shows how misinformation can be distributed and populated in a fake internet. And you have chats with people, and you actually see. I mean, there's this snippet from their website about how this fake website, which you are now navigating, is all about sharing what we the people believe and what we want to say, and there is no censorship. Yeah, the game concludes once you've shared 50 articles with your followers who are actively leaving comments on them too, which you can read and see. And you can kind of see that in this little tidbit down here. If you click on that, it brings up the comment section of each article. And the most the most innocent one of these is stevia really all that healthy? Should you ditch Diet Coke? And then you can kind of see some more comments there about it. And that's at the very beginning of the game. So if you were looking forward to playing it, there's not really any spoilers. But if you Google the Mix Archives and then just search on itch for that, it's on itch.io. It's a Windows build only, I believe. But yeah, you should definitely check this out. I did just get a message from one of the developers this morning about any more information and that I needed, and I said if you send me more of it, I will gladly share it. But yeah, this is one of my favorite projects of my peers right now, and I've been following it closely. I played through the majority of it. I'm sure I missed some stuff, but yeah, it's crazy because they have a whole search function, and you are really just browsing an archive, and it's fantastic. So now comes the part where usually at this point, when I explain this concept to people about InteraCity and what is actually going on in your head when you're playing this game, people kind of groan at me. So you can't really in any medium simulate an accurate depiction of a non-abstracted world, right? That is impossible. So it was a pretty conscious design decision for me to make InteraCity a tabletop game in which you're sitting face to face with people, deciding where you're going to put down these tokens and where you're going to put down these buildings. And in addition to that, it was also a very conscious decision to not name these buildings anything, right? Some of these are actually kind of funny. There's an ice cube factory. That's pointless, right? So what that does is it kind of depersonalizes this city and it kind of depersonalizes the places that you are, and you don't care who's living in the villa. You don't care who's living in the apartment building. And you know, the livelihoods of who's living there are not your concern. Your concern is fulfilling your goal and building that. That's fun. That's a game. But it's also how, in many ways, our leaders see our society and see the way that we are planning things. And you get players to into that mindset and lock them in there. And then at the end of the game, when you say this, they're like, okay, all right, buddy. they, but it's true, and it kind of gets in that mindset. So sometimes it's hard to contrast and think like, how could somebody see it that way? But and then there's also a few other things here that I just want to touch on. Like, for example, when you have competitive play where players want to achieve their goal before anyone else, it's pretty hostile. It's it's kind of scary. So I'm probably going to keep this game cooperative because I don't really want to incite that kind of angry, argumentative state in people. But yeah, so I think that's oh yeah. So basically, conclusion, because I'm a student and you have to have a conclusion, marked conclusion. We just kind of build our experiences to form contrasts in the experience, the narrative, and the play. So by that I mean when you're thinking about thematically what this is going to be, and you're thinking about how the experience of actually playing this and being a part of this is going to be, like, what is that in whole in the mechanics? You have to think about how those are going to affect the player and what they are going to get out of that. And you know that of course requires extensive research and lots of testing and lots of iteration. And if you know me, you know that I will work on something for about 6 months. I'll have a really awesome game, and then I'll throw the game out, and then I'll start again, and then everyone will say, "Why did you do that?" And it's because of this. Because if I make a thing and I don't start it over from scratch, it's not going to be good and it's not going to be informed. I need that opportunity to do so from what I've learned. So yeah, join everything together with a single idea, deconstruct those cultural inferences, and rock on. That's all I've got. Yeah, Trent. Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Dead of Winter is definitely it right before I started refactoring a lot of this game, and I'll jump back really quick to the beginning of the presentation, like that the visual language that is on these cards was inspired by the way that Dead of Winter actually, yeah. So the original question was, why don't I make this competitive? And it's partially because I'm an art student. I think that's a big one, but part of it is also like making competitive games is all I do. My the thing that might become my thesis is an action roguelike shooter where you are just, it's like Doom and Risk of Rain kind of tearing it up and killing everything. And I like that a lot, and I love combat design. But I really want opportunities to not have games that are just centered around violence and have more, or violence, I guess, and negative to negative player interaction, I guess, is a thing that I'm kind of just so tired of making. But you know, yeah, sure. Yes. Which is what you're saying is what happens in game, right? Success in this game is hard. Yeah. James, or yeah. Yeah, so this kind of loops back into a topic that I was just discussing with Caro, but about abstraction games, where the idea is if you have a fictitious world, a fictitious city, that is abstracting from a real city, and if that had a very low level of abstraction, everything would be perfectly realistic, right? Everything would be simulated. But what disasters do for a game like SimCity is help it make money. They offer a higher level of fiction. They say, look, you can create an awesome metropolis, and then you can have a dinosaur made out of school buses and cars come down and blow it up, or you can have an alien invasion. And for a lot of people, that's what makes the game fun. They like to build up that huge society and then blow it up, or they like to have in SimCity 2013, which arguably I think is the worst SimCity. Um, they do one really cool thing where if you have really bad crime in your city, you will get a superhero who shows up. He doesn't do anything, but he shows up, and he just flies around in a circle, and it's the stupidest thing. But yeah, the presence of disasters in games like this just kind of helps to push that narrative that these are games and not things that we can learn from. But I think that slowly, as you know, the first SimCity came out in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, by the point that someone has played that and the domino effect has happened and they have grown up to become a city planner, should we really be sitting here thinking? I think the main thing is what impact do the disasters have, and that is the question that has been bounced around a lot. Some people say they're annoying. Some people say they get in the way, while others are very adamant that they need to be there because if they're not there, these aren't games, these are simulations. But I think that the game series Democracy has kind of proven that you can make a simulation into something that nerds will love, and that's awesome. That's really cool. So, does that answer your question, I guess? Hmm. Well, that's also that's another thing that people have talked about, how they're not realistic disasters. They're just disasters. You trigger an earthquake, your city shifts, and then after like 10 minutes of gameplay, you've rebuilt all the roads and all the buildings are back up, and there's, you don't have any catastrophes about lives lost. You don't think about water. You don't think about it's just over and it's just done. Yeah, so that is sort of one big topic as well, that if you're going to include disasters, then they should be realistic. And there's a game, it's called New City, and it is an indie game that wants to recapture the magic that was previously from SimCity 4, released in 2004. The game I was reading ages ago a developer log from the developer, and I could be mistaken, and I will try to find this for you. But he was talking about how so many people have been like, when can I destroy it? When can I blow up my city? Because this game is all about building massive cities. That's the idea. It's you build as far as you want, as much as you want, and you just deal with it. You deal with these regions, and you build, and you just whatever. And he was like, I don't really want to do that yet because I don't know what I want to do with that yet because I want to make them realistic and I want to make them portray actual things. And I thought that was really cool. It's still in early access. He hasn't added them yet. I don't know if he will. But yeah, I would check that out. I think Lexi, you had an up. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's pretty funny because just from mentioning that, I'm going to slam my friend TJ for a second here. When we were doing this playtest that you can see in this screenshot, TJ is the fellow in the blue shirt. He hates people in board games. He is active. He doesn't care about winning. He just wants to make everyone else upset. And in this case, he really did. They could not do anything because he was just getting in the way, and or at least was trying to, as everyone was arguing and pleading, please don't do that. So you're absolutely right. People are going to tear this apart. So it's a funny example, but yeah. And then we had more hands. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah, so That's no. That was no. No, I understand that. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Yeah, it's critical. It's yeah. So that's one thing that I this is okay. I should also have mentioned that this is very it's not very early. This is only 6 months of iterate. No, for sure. But the one thing that I do very much want to tackle is the idea of having different player goals that align with different social aspects of what society might be, right? So right now it's all very much just like, wow, you sure do have to build this city. It's hard, but you have to do it. But there's this whole concept that I haven't put into this presentation at all, where every single turn I'd like players to draw event tiles and say like this is actually happening, and you have to do this is X, Y, and Z too. I think I mentioned that to a few people in this room when we were discussing this before, but um, yeah. So there's you definitely have a point. I think the best example in a board game that I can think of is Ticket to Ride, in which players are not actively constantly working against one another, but they do have motivations. You have to get from Detroit all the way to New York, and you have to do that using the resources that you have available. But I think that the thing that I took away from most of what your comment had was that, reflecting on, wow, we sure are in this situation, and the events that led up to this situation sure were not great. And yeah, Coulter. No, no, yeah, sorry. I was specifically mentioning how when Trent said individualized goals per player based on different to create different gameplay scenarios, I was specifically referencing Ticket to Ride's way of doing that. So in this state, you do need to fulfill all of these and you don't get to choose them. What I am thinking about is maybe you draw three and pick one, maybe? Yeah.
That's actually a really slick way of what I was talking around.
Hmm.
Residential and commercial at odds,
Hmm.
they can both succeed until they both can't.
Hmm.
Right? And then it turns from oh, you do your thing, and I do my thing. Well, but then we've got this new plot of land that it's either going to be residential or it's gonna be commercial. It should be. So I
Hmm.
think that's sort of the idea.
Hmm. Yeah, let's go to Kara and then, yep.
Guess I have a design challenge for you, which is that what does this play like if there
What does this play like if there's no economic system? Yes. Blasphemy.
there's exchange?
Mhm.
So how does this game play that lends away?
It's just really, I guess it would probably be, it would probably be really peaceful. But I'm trying to, I don't think I can answer this in the time that I have here, but no, it's a good thought provocation. Yeah. Yeah. And you would probably devolve because the only player who doesn't have, where is it? Yeah. So the only player who doesn't actually have something that revolves around the economy is the infrastructure player who just has to flip over six tiles who gets to place them for free. So I'd imagine if you really break it down, players would not care about anything else. There would be no personal goals. And they'd be like, oh, how quickly can we make the best infrastructure? Which I think is ironic. But no, that's a really cool thought experiment. And I'm gonna think about that and get back to you, to be honest. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. There's a secret fifth role that I haven't discussed with anyone in this room. It is called Parks and Recreation. It's something fictional in which it's the purple cards up here, and the idea is that they don't actually they function around other cards. Every card in this game has to be placed adjacent to a road. Parks and Recreation can be placed anywhere, adjacent to anything. And they start with a lot of money, and they just want to get rid of it and give it to people. That's how that works. And it's like yeah, and you have to. If you don't give out all that money, you lose. So it's the antithesis of everything else in this game. And my friend Muchi is playing it there. And he was just looking at me like, I am not having fun. I'm so bored. And I felt really bad because he wanted the challenge that everyone else had of like, how am I going to sustain this, and where am I going to place this next building, and what's the most up? He was just like, I'm going to give you a lot of money, and I'm going to give you a lot of money, and it was weird. It was weird. But that's also probably my fault. That's why it's a secret. But now you know the secret. Everyone in this room knows this very private secret. But yeah, we had another hand up.
No, this is a simulation. Yeah, well, he didn't simulate the water. Of course, we should show that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Something in front of one of the least realistic.
Mhm.
City building.
Mhm.
There's no consequence. Like that you have to discuss it.
Mhm.
You know, if you want to get at some of the aspects of what I'm talking about, which is that kind of competition land use plan
Mhm.
that also has pro-social aspects. One of the things is constrained space, because that makes those decisions a little.
Mhm.
I can take away this residential development and put in industry, but then, you know,
Mhm.
doesn't get more consequences. So that's something you might want to think a little bit. You know, a little bit. It's a lot of what planners do. Kind of decisions, and they all do it with the select portion of the population that's going to be affected.
Yeah, that's really informational. Thank you.
It makes me think like fluxes where the game win conditions actually are changing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Then all of a sudden the game win condition changes. So that would be crazy too. Like you built this out with one expectation, but now the win condition is completely changed, right? And it's like, oh my God, okay, how are we going to retrofit what we have to this new win condition? That'd be pretty severe though.
Coulter?
Talk about working on the third dimension, the z-axis.
Oh man. Yeah. that's about as much as I have to say on that. It's tough. I tried one time, and everything fell over. It fell apart. And then I gave up because it's not sustainable. But oh, I totally misunderstood what you meant and embarrassed myself. Yeah, no, there's a few cards in this game. Like, we're gonna look at the really stupidly complicated one for just a sec. There you go. Yeah, the reason I think this is the most powerful card in the game is because you can remove an industry tile and slow down their success, and it's not that hard to trigger. I just am really bad at writing things. Yeah, so yes, so there's currently one card in the game that does what you're talking about, but as I've designed it more and also talking about constraints and also talking about replacement and building cities vertically, that kind of is something that I want to explore more for sure. Is that a hand up as well? Yeah, no, that's a significantly better idea than my whole thing of, wow, let's get some D&D stands and glue them together. And yeah, I'm glad I'm not a real engineer because that would be a disaster. But yeah, we're over time. But if anybody wants to discuss, I'm really, really awesome, and I totally, definitely, 100% put my contact information on the slides. But if you just go to joshhirshfield.com, you can find everything there. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.